Enjoy. And Donna Hewlett is presenting, and Marge Goodbrock and Debbie Adler.
Oh, maybe they're taking this one.
No, not at all.
This first quilt is a quilt that was made by my great-grandmother Nancy Metzger Brown sometime before she passed away in 1929. It was the top of the quilt was given to me by my dad's cousin, my second cousin, Nancy Stoddard Brown. This is her here, right there. Picture. And she said it was her grandmother's quilt and quilt top and would I like to finish it? And I said, oh my yes, because I didn't have anything of my family. Looking through genealogy books that my little sister did, found out her grandmother's my great-grandmother. So I hand quilted and finished it. It's a typical utility quilt. I think this was probably a man's nightshirt or something like that. Okay, you'll notice that, see, there's, different fabrics in it. That one right over there even has, so that's why I say it's a utility quilt, because they were using the fabric that they had at the time. I hand quilted the quilt, as I said, and finished it. Okay, right here. Every quilt needs to have a label on it. I don't know how many antique quilts I've seen, and nobody knows who did it or anything about it. And so I really think that every quilt needs to have a label with the information. This particular one, I put a pocket on it, and I've got the picture of Nancy and I, and some other things. And then somebody said, well, what if they wash it? And I said, well, hopefully they'd be smart enough to take that thing out, the paper's out of the pocket, I don't know. But that's just my personal preference. I haven't ever seen a pocket on another quilt. But it's important to have a label on a quilt, and my quilt group ladies call me the label police. This next one is a Sunbonnet Sioux, and that's one of the really popular older quilt blocks. I purchased this at an estate sale of the Pryor family here in Sheridan, 2006 or 2007, I can't remember. The Methodist ladies were having the estate sale, and they found quilts in a truck up in the attic, and this is the sad thing about this quilt is, well, the top, is really nicely done. It's all hand worked together, a lot of work on that. But again, nobody knows, because as far as they know, Mrs. Pryor wasn't a quilter. No one ever saw her doing quilts or anything. So they have no idea who made this, how it happened to be in that truck in the house or anything. But I bought it at the estate sale because I'm rather fond of Sunbonnet Sioux. And the back of the quilt was really heavily stained, and so I just, over the top of it, I put this muslin top just to protect it more. This one also was purchased at the Pryor sale, estate sale. Sharon Kulik is now the owner of this. She bought this quilt. The airplane blocks are all hand appliqued on the top of the muslin block, and then it's all hand quilted around. So, this is, just stop and think how much time was put into that. And again, no way to know who did it, why they did it, why did they pick airplanes to make a quilt, I can picture that some little boy must have had it on a bed, I don't know. But it's in really, really good shape, and as you can see on the back of it, it's not, there's some stains and things on it, but yet it's in good shape and not really so bad. Okay, good, number 4. This is a wedding quilt made from embroidered squares that were done by the people who attended the wedding of Letitia and Ernest Hast on November the 25th, 1909. The squares were all done in red thread by men and women alike. And so they did, the work on it, and just look at all the neat things that are on it and everything. Each square seems to share some significance for the newlyweds. These quilt squares were found in a safekeeping box after my grandmother. Now this was done by Marilyn Bride Levy, so this would have been done after her grandmother passed away in 1957. There weren't enough to complete the quilt without leaving out some, so Marilyn's mother, Loisel Bride, asked some of her grandmother's friends to make a quilt square to complete the quilt. It was finished by a quilting group in Grand Round. November the 25th often falls on Thanksgiving Day. Now, Marilyn, isn't that date on there somewhere? Oh, there. So there's the date right there, November 25th. Yeah. Often falls on Thanksgiving Day and became a very important day in the Hass family. As Loisel and Cliff Bride, Loisel would be a daughter, and Iola and Harold Myers, it's the other daughter, were both married on November 25th when it fell on Thanksgiving Day. A lot of work in that one too. And look, see, you can really see and admire the hand quilting on the back. Okay, this next quilt sure I've got the right number. Is a nursery rhyme quilt made from embroidered squares in 1920. Somewhere on it. Yes. The patterns for the squares were published in the Oregonian, and Marilyn's grandmother, Letitia Hass, cut them out and traced them onto the squares by her mother, Loisel Bride, to embroider. Loisel had been in bed for nearly a year when she was 4 years old due to an appendectomy, so her grandmother taught her to embroidery so she would have something to do. At the time, Marilyn's mother, Marilyn's aunt, Iola Myers, who was born 8 weeks premature, was living in a chicken incubator. So the grandmother, well, the mother to them, was quite a busy lady. The quilt squares were found in the safekeeping box after the grandmother passed away in 1957. Now, Loisel, that would be your mother, took the squares to a ladies' quilting group in Grand Round where the quilt was assembled. And it's really fun, you know. Bye, baby bunting, daddy's gone a-hunting. Up here, old Mother Goose now leads the way for all the funny folks to play. She'll have a party just for you if careful stitching you can do. Make you want to be very careful to do it right. And again, you can see the quilting back. All right, now this next one is... Okay, a Crazy Quilt Star, and it's made by Margie Goodbrod's grandmother, Arndt, sometime in the 1880s.
Wow.
She lived here outside of Sheridan on the road to Ballston. As you're going straight out of town, there's a house that you go right straight down instead of going on the curb. That's where she lived.
Oh my gosh.
And notice all I don't know what you call that stitching there, but it's really nice. And it's heavier fabrics and everything. Hard, taken from me, it's hard to work on that kind of stuff.
Definitely heavy.
Uh-oh.
Oh, it's corduroys and wool, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's wool inside of it.
Minced suiting and stuff. So, boy, if you had that on the bed, it would be heavy. Oh, and this is...
There's my grandmother.
There, you found it. Good. This is her grandmother right here. Augusta Arndt. Yes. She's not smiling. They never smiled in the pictures.
Isn't that funny how they didn't smile?
Well, they didn't have a whole lot to smile about. Life was hard, I guess.
Well, part of it came with the way the photograph was taken. Is you had to be still for so long. That's what I've
Yeah,
Okay,
that makes
this
sense.
This one is another Crazy Quilt Star, hand-tied by her grandmother sometime in the 1880s. And it's just, see the star, and then look, this makes kind of a hexagon here, then it makes this thing here. which is kind of like.
Oh, I didn't even see that.
They used everything. I mean,
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
everything they had.
There's
Yeah, I didn't
One
either.
here with a buttonhole. See the buttonhole?
Yeah. Yeah, they used
Tipped over his
everything.
clothes on somebody's
see
school
there's
clothes.
kind of a velvet here, and then kind of this plaid, and this one.
Well, I found one with a little like a sailor's anchor on it.
I think that was towards the tail end.
Yeah.
And now this one was, well, it was the quilting on it, but this one was tied. And they, a lot of times that's how they did it too. For one thing, I don't think they were thinking of how pretty the quilt was going to look 100 years later. They needed a quilt for a bed.
They needed
Okay, now this quilt comes from Viola Blair Boyer, and she said they always called it a necktie quilt. However, nowadays this is called a bow tie quilt block. But this is all hand-pieced by her great-grandmother Minerva Jane Ove in the mid-1930s.
Wow.
And if you go up on the hill at the Masonic Cemetery, you're going to see that name on quite a lot of graves up there. So there was a lot of family there. It was hand quilted by Viola's mother, Floy Ove Blair, and we don't really have a date for that. But it's really a neat example. I'm sure that this was all fabrics that were from clothing that had been made in the family at some time.
Yeah, and then they took a punk out of the tree next to it, carved it in.
Okay, this one is another Sunbonnet Sue. Sunbonnet Sue was a popular block, but you noticed, if you remember from the other one, lots of different versions of it. This one is highly decorated with embroidery on it. Okay, this was hand-pieced and hand-quilted by Floy Blair for her granddaughter, Gail Yoder, in 1959. The fabrics and scraps are from clothes that Floy and her daughter made for themselves or their children. And this quilt now belongs to Gail Yoder, who is Viola Blair Yoder's daughter. This one is a Scrappy Star quilt, hand-pieced and hand-quilted by Floy Ove Blair in the mid-1940s. And again, some of the fabrics were from clothes made by Floy for her daughters, including Viola Blair Boyer, who now owns the quilt. And when Viola was showing me this, she was pointing out certain ones that were from her dress or her sister's dress. She remembers a lot of the different ones in that. And again, with this solid on the back, it really shows the hand building. This is a really nice stained birds and flowers, hand embroidered and put together and hand quilted by the ladies of the Buell Grange, and it was bound by Velma Blair Walker. And this is not real easy to do, this kind of binding on a quilt. But they're all hand embroidered with all the different states. I lost my place. It's number 11, right? Yeah. Okay. It was a raffle for the quilt was held in the fall of 1952, and Viola Blair Boyer won it.
So 2004, 2005, 7.
If you look at this really close, you can pick out kind of the bird on it or the other thing, you know, look at there. Kind of interesting to see. Okay, these are applique butterflies. This is a really interesting one. Hand-pieced and appliqued by Mary Tharps Phillips, the great-grandmother Rhoda Youngblood Lynn, sometime before her death in 1945. And the interesting thing about this is all the embroidery work with all this satin stitching, and all this is hand satin stitched all the way around every one of those butterflies.
From that parent, because it was a machine done. That's all hand done.
It's all hand done, yeah.
Yeah.
There's no, there's nothing on the backside there that shows.
It was passed on to Mary about 30 years ago, and it's never been washed, so you can still see the pencil markings. Mary was pointing some of them out to me, but, well, you can see the lines here where they did the hand quilting.
Nice quilting.
Oh, wow. Okay, this is called a double wedding ring. It was made for Mary Tharp Phillips, I'm sorry, by her mother Sadie Rhoda Lynn Tharp for her 18th birthday, by Sadie's mother Rhodey Youngblood Lynn, who lived in Dallas, Oregon. Rhoda is Mary's great-grandmother, and Mary remembers sleeping under this quilt so often when she was a child and went to visit. And again, we've got this. This is a tricky way to bind, and all these little pieces. These little pieces were probably a little piece of cardboard, and they traced around it and then cut it out with scissors. They don't do it that way now.
I did once.
I started out that way. And now, one thing, the quilting, hand quilting shows up really well on this, but if it's a print like this, it doesn't show up quite as much. Okay, this quilt is called an Irish chain. And again, this was made by Rhoda Youngblood Lynn in 1935. Hand-pieced and hand-quilted. It's been passed down from family member to family member and was passed by Sadie Lynn Tharp to her daughter Mary Tharp Phillips, about in 1986. Now, the lady who made this, Rhoda Youngblood Lynn, is Mary's great-grandmother. And this is a really pretty example of a really planned quilt, not just, put together. It's all the same colors. And
Oh, Susie.
This one's my favorite.
and
Really?
look at the fine quilting, on the back. I really appreciate that one. This is a really neat one. This is an Amish Irish chain made by Lois Chamberlain Hudson and given to her daughter Susan in 1996. Lois has embroidered, and we can't see it because it's on the bottom, but yay, we have a quilt with a label on it. You can't see it because it's underneath all this. But she has embroidered Susie, Love, and Mater in 1996. That's what Lois used. Instead of saying mother, it was Mater. On the back corner of the quilt is where you see that embroidery. The dark colors are very typical of the Amish colors used in their quilts. And again, it was a truly planned quilt. It's not a scrap quilt at all. It's a planned quilt pattern. And here is the Irish chains going around, and then all this wonderful hand embroidery work on it.
5 years it took her to make that.
Yeah, and it's going to disappear.
Isn't it beautiful?
Favorite. You can see all the
And
nice
you can see all, look at all those little tiny stitches, all done with the needle and by hand.
Everything.
Okay, now this is what's called a scrap utility quilt. And I tried to figure out if it wasn't somehow in a planned pattern or something, but it just is the way it works out. Although, if you can follow these, they go up and up and up and up, and then all of a sudden they don't go up anymore. And they come down and down and down. So, but still, it's a very typical of the quilts that were made during World War II by the war mothers who had family fighting, and many had a son or a family member that was killed in the war. And the war mothers did a lot of these, and you'll notice it's not hand quilted or anything, it's tied.
My grandmother was part of that in Woolmine. My grandmother was part of the...
Oh, yes, her grandmother was. Susan remembers that the quilt was always on her grandfather's bed. It's machine pieced and then hand tied, and the binding is sewn down by hand.
I couldn't stay away.
And it's got a neat plaid back. So this looks like a grandpa's quilt, doesn't it?
It does.
This is, the pattern is a very typical pattern from a long time ago. It's called Drunkard's Path. So it's this blue here with this white right there. But the way it's put together makes this design. Thank you. And there's lots of stories about Drunkard's Path. Like, you know, way back when the women were trying to keep the men from doing all the drinking, they, you know, Drunkard's Path. But it can be arranged a lot of ways so it doesn't look, you know, like this. So this quilt was purchased by Tammy Hansen at an estate sale. The quilt was hand-pieced and hand-quilted by Isla Branson, Mrs. Archie Branson, in the mid-1930s. The Bransons owned a grocery store and lived in Ballston, Oregon, in Bellevue, Oregon, Bellevue, in Yamhill County. And it's a lovely example of hand quilting and all. And Tammy's maybe thinking that somebody in the family might want it back. She's going to look into that, but because there's no label on it. But you see, she bought it. She knew the people who bought the estate sale. It's a beautiful quilt, and again, I keep saying it over and over. But you know, you have to have done some hand quilting to really appreciate how much that little stitching takes.